After the end of World War I, the Bolsheviks annulled the Brest-Litovsk Treaty and moved forces westward to reclaim the Ober-Ost regions abandoned by the Germans. Vladimir Lenin viewed the newly independent Poland as a critical route for spreading communist revolutions into Europe. Meanwhile, Polish leaders, including Józef Pilsudski, aimed to restore Poland's pre-1772 borders because he was a Hearts of Iron IV gamer. Although 1919 Polish forces occupied much of present-day Lithuania and Belarus, and emerged victorious in the Polish-Ukrainian War. However, Soviet forces would regain strength after their victories in the Russian Civil War, and the leader of the Ukrainian People's Republic was forced to ally with Pilsudski in 1920 to resist the advancing Bolsheviks. This here was the height of the Polish-Soviet War. The Soviet Red Army launched a successful counteroffensive starting in June 1920. By August, the Soviet troops had pushed Polish forces back to Warsaw. The Battle of Warsaw was fought from August 1920 as the Red Army forces were commanded by Mikhail Tukhachevsky, approached the Polish capital and the nearby fortresses. On August 16th, Polish forces commanded by Pilsudski counterattacked from the south and disrupted the enemy offensive, which forced the Russians into a disorganized withdrawal eastward. At the decisive Battle of Warsaw, Polish forces had achieved an unexpected victory and turned the tide of the war. The battle is often referred to as the Miracle on the Vistula and is considered one of the most important military triumphs in Polish history. The war would end in October of 1920, with an official peace being signed in March of 1921. The defeat at Warsaw crippled the Red Army, and Vladimir Lenin called it an enormous defeat for his forces, and in the following months, several more Polish follow-up victories had secured Poland's independence from the Soviet Union, and later secured the Polish state's eastern frontiers until 1939. But what if, in an alternate timeline, things were different, and the Soviets were able to defeat the Polish in the Polish-Soviet War? Changes to occur in this alternate timeline to produce a Soviet victory lay in the Battle of Warsaw, and Stalin not being able to be in charge of any military forces. You see, Little J had disobeyed orders in early August 1920 when he attempted to conquer Lvov rather than transfer his troops to assist Tukhachevsky's forces that were attacking Warsaw. In Moscow, Lenin and Trotsky would blame him for his behavior in the Polish-Soviet War, and Stalin's secretary, Boris Basovnov, would argue that the offensive against Warsaw failed because Stalin and his army did not comply with orders of the commander-in-chief, and Tukhachevsky himself would also blame Little J for his defeat in the Battle of Warsaw. Now that the Soviets had secured a victory over Poland in this timeline, how's it going to affect not just Soviet Russia and Poland, but the rest of Europe? Well, starting with Poland, the Polish population isn't going to be too overjoyed being under Soviet occupation. During the Polish-Soviet War, the Soviets had executed many Polish officers who were POWs, and after defeating the entirety of Poland, the Soviets are likely going to execute many of Poland's high-ranking military leaders. Additionally, the Red Terror will occupy Poland and will see many Poles be executed and sent to the gulags, which again isn't going to make the Soviets overly popular. Effects on the Russian Civil War are not going to be all sunshine and rainbows for the Red Army after they defeat Poland. The Bolsheviks will have exhausted many resources to finish Poland off and now occupy the country. This by no means will make the White Army somehow win the Russian Civil War. However, it does mean that the Red Army would again be using more resources that would have been used elsewhere, such as in the Soviet-Ukraine War. In Central and Eastern Europe, the Red Scare is going to be in full swing for incumbent anti-Bolshevik governments in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and others. Low-level Bolshevik movements in Eastern Europe will be inspired by the Soviet victory and could increase their operations, but would be met with swift force. Any threats against countries around Poland, such as Czechoslovakia, by the Red Army, would be met with equally appropriate force. Just look at what went down with the Czechoslovak Legion in Siberia. I guarantee you that the Bolsheviks won't want to deal with them again. As for the rest of Europe, Mussolini and his fascists in Italy are still going to seize power in 1922. A lot of similar reactionary groups in Europe will use the fall of Poland to the Soviets as a justification for their policies and movements. I'm not saying that this means Britain and France are going to go full fascist, but with Soviet Russia even closer to Central Europe without Poland as a buffer, governments are going to be cracking down harder and worrying more about communist movements. Something else to note is that during the Battle of Warsaw, Charles de Gaulle was present as a military advisor for Polish forces, and if the Soviets won the battle, things for de Gaulle are very up in the air. Will he escape Poland or be killed? That will of course heavily influence the future of France in World War II and the Cold War, but I can't accurately predict that aspect. On to Germany, what I'm sure a lot of people were waiting to hear about. Now, Germany at this time had just put down the Spartacist uprisings and was involved in the Silesia uprisings. Additionally, the Weimar government had witnessed the Kapp-Putsch and mass political instability as paramilitary groups with ideologies all across the political spectrum had more strength than the Weimar government itself. Now, with Bolshevism on a weak Germany's doorstep, there's a chance that Britain would support less restrictions on Germany, and there's even a slight potential that France might soften its stances against Germany, and with that, Germany will also be moving politically to the right and could be working a lot more with paramilitary groups such as the Freikorps, which ironically might hinder the Angry Mustache model and his movements, but I can't accurately predict that. Now, could the Soviets actually hold on to Poland? Well, yes, if the Red Army is willing to maintain the numbers and resources in the country, as Polish rebels are still harassing the Bolsheviks in the brutally occupied countries. There are also increased right-wing and reactionary elements across the rest of Europe, and Soviet Russia would begin to see more of a power struggle between Stalin and Trotsky over the issues of Poland and war communism, as the Soviets are surrounded by more militarized enemies. Additionally, since the Soviets own Poland, this is seen as controlling the center of Europe, and Trotskyists would be advocating for moving elements against Central Europe now. Lasting impacts of the Soviets controlling Poland would see an unknown leader of the USSR come to power and decide to either crack down harder on Poland and put more into the defense of the Soviet Union, or Trotskyism will prevail where the Soviets go to war with the rest of Europe in the late 1920s. There's just no telling which ideology will prevail out of a Soviet victory in Poland without Stalin commanding troops. Of course, Poland itself would be devastated by the Soviet occupation. Uncomfortably, a Soviet-led World War II in the late 1920s and early 1930s would normalize fascism in Europe as an ally against the Soviets. But how this potential alternate World War II goes is beyond my ability to predict in this video. What do you think would have happened had the Soviets won the Polish-Soviet War? Write in the comments, and thank you for watching.